The committee will now come to order. I note that a quorum is present and that each member has been provided the material on our agenda today. I recognize myself to make a brief opening statement. I'm very happy to be convening this markup today to discuss several topics and our bills that are important to all of our citizens in the nation, but particularly in rural America, ranging from support for our 1890s land grant institutions, management of chronic wasting disease, adding value to crop residues, and the restoration of our great national forests. Our national forests particularly are enduring some of the most ravaging fires in our nation's history. And we on the House Agriculture Committee are committed to making sure we have the necessary resources to protect and enhance and continue to grow our great forest industry. The bills before us cover a wide variety of matters supported by both Republicans and Democrats, and I look forward to having a productive and respectful debate on each of them. And as chairman of this committee, it's important to me that we continue our work for American agriculture and our rural communities, and today's meeting handles that very precisely. And now I yield to our ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity for members to come together and advance thoughtful solutions at this markup. Among the bills I'm excited we will consider bipartisan legislation that my friend Ron Kine and I have been working on for months, H.R. 5608, the Chronic Wasting Disease Research and Management Act. CWD has been a big problem for the deer population of Pennsylvania for quite some time. But the problem doesn't stop in my home state. The disease has spread to at least 25 states across the country. Unfortunately, because there is no known cure for CWD and we still know very little about the disease, how the disease is transmitted, that number is sure to rise. And through continuous conversations with industry stakeholders in both the farmed and the wild deer communities, we have been able to identify priority areas for much needed research and on-the-ground management efforts to attempt to combat continued spread. I'm hopeful with the passage of this bill and the eventual support of our friends on the Appropriations Committee, this disease will receive the attention and financial resources warranted. I also want to take a moment to recognize my colleagues, Mr. Johnson and Mr. Cuellar, for their introduction of the Cattle Contract Library Act of 2021, another bill that we will consider today. I know that the concept of a contract library is also one that Mrs. Hartzler has promoted through previously introduced legislation, so I would be remiss if I didn't recognize her leadership on this matter as well. As this committee has seen firsthand, there are a lot of competing ideas on how to address the challenges facing the cattle industry, and I appreciate the efforts made to navigate those complex and competing ideas in pursuit of what I view as a very pragmatic middle ground. Now, we have heard loud and clear the desire for more market transparency, hopefully with more market knowledge about the types of contracts offered. Producers stand a better chance of negotiating beneficial terms to sell their cattle. I will be supporting both these bills, not only because I support the policy, but also because each bill is a product of bipartisan member and staff level discussions, taking into account input from stakeholders and valuable technical feedback from USDA. There were other bills scheduled for this markup that, after appropriate vetting, were not deemed ready. Other bills, despite an expedited process with agencies and stakeholders, were found ready for markup. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the bipartisan vetting that occurred on these bills, and I certainly hope this collaborative process will guide our future work. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your passion for our 1890 institutions and your work to ensure scholarship programs exist to promote agriculture opportunities to a wide swath of students. Also pleased to learn that more than 685 students have benefited thus far. I genuinely look forward to learning more about their experience, their retention, and all that they've achieved and will achieve after a great education is completed. Without this information, I do question why we would move to make the program permanent, but as I said, I want to work with you, and I think there's an opportunity to work together and make certain your efforts, a pillar of your work, come to fruition. And I welcome ongoing conversations and your commitment to doing so. That said, I'll be supporting your bill before us today. I appreciate your work on this front, and I look forward to working together. So, Mr. Chairman, I again want to air my previous comments and ask for your commitment that this committee move to fulfill its obligation in oversight and implementation of the Farm Bill and address the many concerns of which our shared constituencies are pleading with us to provide wisdom and guidance. This committee should not remain in the crosshairs of the political theater that the rest of Washington seems to be swept into. And with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much, and I yield back.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member, and I certainly deeply appreciate the kind and supportive words that you have shared this morning with the progress of making sure that we keep our 1890s Student Scholarship Program for the 1890s African American colleges and universities going forward. And it's so great that we have bipartisan support, and I want to say thank you for that. Now, the chair would request that other members submit their opening statements for the record. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee subject to the call of the chair at any point during this meeting. And I would like to remind members that only amendments germane to the subject matter before us today shall be in order. Pursuant to Clause 7 of House Rule 16, no motion or proposition on a subject different than that under consideration shall be admitted under color of amendment. And members are reminded to please unmute when you are recognized to speak and appear on the screen, and when you are called to vote. Pursuant to Committee Rule 3I and House Rule 11, Clause 2, the chair may postpone further proceedings today on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote is ordered. And now, I call up for consideration our first bill, H.R. 4252, a bill I've sponsored to provide additional funding for scholarships at the 1890s and to make this scholarship program a permanent program so that we can know and have this great opportunity at our 1890s for generations to come, and the confidence within our 1890s to know that this program is secure and that adequate planning and the number of students coming in. And I might add, as many of you were here, I think we had full committee participation when we invited these 19 college presidents of the African American 1890s land grant colleges and universities. And as Ranking Member mentioned, the huge number, over 600, I think it's 675 of our students are now benefiting from that, and more will come. And so I just want to thank you for that. So without objection, the Subcommittee on Biotechnology, Horticulture, and Research is discharged from further consideration of H.R. 4252. And without objection, the first reading of the bill is waived and is open for amendment at any time. And now I recognize myself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4252, which is now at the desk. Without objection, the reading of the amendment is waived, and the substitute will be considered as original text for the purposes of further amendment. And now I recognize myself for 5 minutes to speak on the bill. I can't tell you all how much it is my distinct honor to bring up for consideration today H.R. 4252. And it has such a rich history within the House Agriculture Committee to have the great distinction of being a very, not just an historic bill, but an historic bipartisan bill. And that is so important to all of us, that this is a bill for and about all of America. And so this is why it means so much to me to have this bill as a bipartisan bill with both Democratic and Republican support. Now, let me just also add that as a graduate of one of our 1890s land-grant colleges, Florida A&M University, I know firsthand how impactful the 1890s land-grant institutions are for our students. And I, along with some others, proud graduates of 1890s land-grant institutions, have been working diligently on this issue for a number of years. And seeing this bill move forward is great progress for these institutions and for all of the students. The foundation for this bill was laid in the last Farm Bill, and this is yet another step toward building the necessary pipeline of more talented young minds for our food and our agriculture sector. Our bill ensures that this vital scholarship program is authorized permanently. I urge my colleagues to support this important bill, and I look forward to your continued support as we push this bill out of this committee onto the floor of the House of Representatives, over to the Senate, and to the White House for the President's signature. This is the beginning of just a great moment in the history of our nation. And with that, I will yield to the ranking member. Oh. Yeah. You're 5 minutes, ranking member. I'm sorry.
No problems, Chairman. Thank you. I appreciate your passion for this issue. I share that passion. You and my commitment to work with you on this bill. I look forward to receiving further vetting from the department to better understand how these scholarships are helping students across the nation. However, I will note that this makes permanent the scholarship program, in essence amending the 2018 Farm Bill provision without oversight or implementation updates. And I would ask, Mr. Chairman, with the support of all the members to join me as in ensuring that this committee returns to the business of oversight. You know, the statutory report required in the 2018 Farm Bill will not be available until at least the first quarter of 2022, as grants were dispersed in 2019. And Virginia Tech has been contracted to gather that data, including the amount of funds provided to each eligible college or university, the number of scholarships awarded under each grant each fiscal year, and the amount of each scholarship. Now, while the department stated that we're likely to see retention and outcomes included in the Virginia Tech report, the statute does not require as such. The efficacy of the program is unknown at this point. Now, I hope the department has encouraged Virginia Tech to compile this data. For those curious, A&S scored 0. The rescission and direct spending cancel one another out. And so while I hope to work with the chairman on improvements, I do support the bill and will vote favorably for it. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Now, before we begin with any amendments, does any other member wish to speak on the bill?
Mr. Chairman. This is turn.
Mr.
Chairman,
For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I request to speak on the bill for 5 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as an original co-sponsor of the bill, I want to speak in strong support of H.R. 4252. Moving this bill means now that we are taking action on a great idea at a great time. Quite frankly, I don't think that there is a single congressional district in the nation that hasn't benefited immeasurably from the contributions of 1890s graduates. While I am not as lucky as some of my colleagues who get to brag about 1890 institutions in their districts, I am still glad to throw my full endorsement behind the scholarship program. As members of the Agriculture Committee, we are charged with working to build a more just and resilient food system. That will require us to think holistically and creatively. We will finally need to recognize, for example, that food is a fundamental human right, that hunger is a political condition, and that our farmers can be our best stewards of the planet. To make that happen, we're going to need our best and brightest to continue pursuing careers in food and agriculture. I can guarantee you that this scholarship program has produced some of our best and brightest since its inception, which is why it is so critical that we permanently authorize the program. So I want to thank Chairman Scott for making this a priority at such a critical moment, particularly in the shadow of a pandemic that has laid bare the immense challenges that lie ahead. We should be doing everything we can to encourage young minds to take on these challenges, and this bill is a great step in the right direction, and I urge everybody on this committee to vote yes. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. McGovern. The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? The gentleman from Georgia. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I intend to support this piece of legislation. I do want to point out that one of the key provisions that you've put in here is that less than 4% of it can be used for administrative fees. So that ensures that the majority of it actually goes to the students and the scholarships. I think that's extremely important. I will tell you, I do wish that we had had a full committee hearing on this, because I would like to bring some people before the committee that have made some accusations about the United States. For example, the CEOs of Coke and Pepsi and Kellogg's and some of the others that wrote such a horrible letter a couple of months ago on Section 1005, and this is obviously coming from Section 1006, and I asked them, what are you doing for the historically black colleges and universities? And I do think that it would have been a good opportunity if we had had a full hearing to point out how little those Fortune 100 companies and Global 100 companies actually do to help the historically black colleges and universities. So I wish that we had had the full hearing to challenge the Coca-Colas and the Pepsis and the Kellogg's and the Nestle's of the world to join us in matching funds to support our HBCUs, and obviously they could do that if they wanted to at this stage. One of my concerns, and this is my ask of you, Mr. Chairman, as we move to make this permanent law, one of my primary concerns is that Title I is a temporary law that was written in the 40s. and every member of this committee knows that we can never allow the ag policy to move back to that. And so as we work to make this and other things permanent law, would you, as the chair of the committee, commit to work with us to make Title I and the things that are necessary for production agriculture permanent law as well?
Am certainly, Mr. Scott, and I certainly commend you on your work in that, and I will commit to work with you on that issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I commend you for your passion on this. I commend you for the way the language is written. 4% overhead is the maximum that there is in there. This is a much better use of funds than Section 1006 was. And so I certainly intend to support the legislation. I appreciate your commitment to help us make Title I permanent law as well. And with that, I yield the remainder of my time.
All right. Thank you. Now, Chairman yields back. Who else expects recognition? Mr. Bishop from Georgia. For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
I'd like to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Scott. I'm very grateful for your continued leadership in recognizing the immense and the positive impact that the 1890 land-grant colleges and universities have had over the last 130 years. And I'm proud to express my support for this legislation today, and I'm delighted that this is a bipartisan effort. This bill to permanently extend and to authorize continued robust funding for the 1890 land-grant institution scholarship program is not only an acknowledgement of the distinguished history of these institutions, but it's also a wise investment in the future of America's agriculture industry. This program provides competitive scholarship funding for students at the 1890 institutions who intend to pursue a career in the food and agricultural sciences. It helps prepare students to tackle pressing challenges in agriculture and food production and to develop innovative programs and solutions while avoiding the crushing student debt as they enter the workforce to do so. I-1890 created a space for African Americans to gain higher education when no other opportunities were available. They've tapped into a historically underappreciated reservoir of talent that has benefited our country as a whole. They continue to touch the life of every American as they encourage our nation's students to pursue careers in agriculture, an industry that creates jobs, boosts the economy, and even protects our national security. I'm proud to say that Georgia, and particularly my district, are part of this distinguished legacy. In order to combat extensive racial discrimination forced on African Americans in the post-Civil War South, the Morrill Act of 1890 established land-grant institutions for Black students whenever a land-grant institution was established exclusively for white students. Many historically Black colleges and universities came into existence as a result of this rule, including the 1895 founding of Fort Valley High and Industrial School, which would later become Fort Valley State College, and finally, currently, the Fort Valley State University. This historically African-American institution remains Georgia's only 1890 land-grant university, and as a result of the 1890 National Scholars Program, Fort Valley was able to award 76 scholarships during the 2020 school year, resulting in a 22% increase in student enrollment for the College of Agriculture. Finally, I'd like to note that my own staff demonstrates the success of the 1890 National Scholars Program. My agriculture issue staffer took part in this program. Affording college for a family with multiple siblings has always been a challenge for families across the country, but this program made it possible for her to attend Tennessee State University, another 1890 institution. In addition to agricultural education and training, this scholarship provided her with networking skills and leadership opportunities she wouldn't have had otherwise. And as a testament to the rich return on investment that we get from these programs, she served as president of a chapter of Minorities in Agriculture, Natural Resources, and Related Sciences, has cultivated a successful 20-year career with the USDA, and has gone forth to serve as a mentor to students and scholars who follow in her footsteps. As America has grown at home and on the world stage, we must continue to increase the number of young people, particularly African Americans, seeking careers in the food and agriculture sciences, including agribusiness, food production, distribution, retailing, energy, renewable fuels, farming, marketing, finance, distribution, conservation, sustainability, and technology. Taking this step forward together ensures that our country benefits from drawing on all communities, including traditionally underrepresented ones. A diverse and inclusive agricultural innovation workforce is vital to our continued position as an industry world leader. So I want to convey my strongest support for this important bill and urge my colleagues to join me in this bipartisan effort. It's a good bill. It's a good proposal. It will mean a great deal to agriculture, and I urge all of my colleagues to support it. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Acosta of California, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word to speak on this very important pieces of legislation, H.R. 4252, for 1890 universities in America. It's, I think, a reflection of your good work and the importance of this piece of legislation that we have the overwhelming bipartisan support to make this a permanent portion of efforts that America has done historically to invest in our infrastructure. And that's what I view this as, an investment in our infrastructure. We look at investments in different ways. Previous colleague mentioned the Mallory Act that President Lincoln signed in July 2nd, 1862. I only mention that because on July 1st, 1862, he signed the legislation to create the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, everybody understands the railroad as an investment in infrastructure, but the very next day, he committed America to investing in land-grant universities. This follows that tradition with the 1890 universities that, frankly, did not get the support that they should have received. And this is an effort to provide support that is fitting and appropriate for these universities across the country. Our colleague, Representative McGovern, indicated about the importance of food to the American family and hunger being a challenge that we face. I'd like to say, and you've heard me mention before, that food is a national security issue. It's a national security issue. The hard work that 4% more or less of the Americans that are directly engaged in the production of food and fiber every day make it possible to put food on America's dinner table. And these universities have such incredible opportunities if they're given the support. And these scholarships would provide the support to use that talent that Representative Bishop talked about, that tremendous amount of young people who are engaged and who want to have an opportunity to participate in one of the great successes of America, which is our ability to not only produce food for our entire country, but to produce more food than we can consume, and to use that as we provide for other parts of the world. And with climate change, I can tell you, as a third-generation farmer, that the challenges that we face today in America to continue that productivity, to provide the most nutritious, advanced production of food and fiber.
I'm actually in a markup for ag, but I'll stay on this.
Members, please. Mute yourself when they're not speaking. If you're not speaking, that's fine, but please mute yourself. You may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm glad our colleague is in a markup for food and ag, and I hope he gets that all worked out. But the fact is I'll close by saying that this legislation, to make it permanent, I think reflects a bipartisan commitment on this committee that we do the right thing. Because I think that, as I tell students, as we all visit our students, that we want them to do well, because guess what? They're our future. If they do well, our country does well. The opportunities for these scholarships for these students will allow them to participate in the 21st century on how we put that food and fiber, not only on America's dinner table, but with climate changes and the population of the planet adding another 2 billion people by the end of, or the middle of this century. That ability to produce food and fiber is a national security issue. These students, when they graduate and they pursue their careers in agricultural initiatives, will add to that value for our country and for the world. So it's a great piece of legislation, and I thank you for your good work.
Thank you, Mr. Costa, for your good words on the bill. Who else seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Lawson, seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and it's really a great opportunity for you and the ranking member to bring bipartisan support to H.R. 4252. This historic legislation is incredibly important to my district because it would make permanent the 1890 Land Grant Institution Scholarship Program and would appropriate about $100 million in scholarship funds. I'm proud to say that I represent Florida A&M University, and 92 scholarships were given out, and had the opportunity to work with former Secretary Perdue and you likewise, Mr. Chairman, in making this a reality. Students come from all over. For example, Congressman Allen, you got about 12 counties. A lot of students come out there, and right next neighbor to me, my friend Austin Scott, many students come from that district to the institution. I had a nephew that graduated from that institution by the 4-point average this year, and he is going to work now for the Department of Agriculture. And many students that I've had the opportunity to engage with and talk to them and go on campus and speak to the dean about how important it is for them to be the next leaders in agribusiness throughout America. Today, some of the largest and most important HBCUs like the significant infrastructure on campus to conduct cutting-edge research in agriculture, which is so needed. And the COVID-19 pandemic has only further highlighted that problem. It is a great opportunity for us to attract these students. I can remember and recall that traveling to South America, and they were so, when I had the opportunity to talk to the leadership over there, they were concerned about how they train students in agribusiness and so forth to get ready, be able to stay, because we depended on them so much for resources. So I can tell you is that this is going to make, and also is making a great impact. Through this bill, the scholarship program will allow 1890s to recruit and train the next generation of agri-leaders. Our next generation of farmers deserve support to ensure the safety of the food supply chain and to address the harmful impact that we had on climate change. On a personal note, my father-in-law was a professor at the University of Florida A&M University, came from Tuskegee, and did his agriculture work at the University of Michigan. And his son, who also graduated from Tuskegee, did his graduate work at Ohio State University. And both of them made a significant impact. I can tell you how proud, if he were today, to see what this program is going to do to really help students become leaders in agriculture and keep America where it should be at the forefront. And I'm telling you, it even making a very significant impact, not only in South Georgia, different place, but throughout the state of Florida in our agriculture union. Therefore, I'm honored to support HR 4252. And Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for all the work that you've done in this area. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lawson. Who else seeks recognition? Hearing no further discussion, without objection, the committee will consider the whole amendment in the nature of a substitute, and it will be open for amendments at any point. Hearing no further amendments, the question now occurs on the reporting of the bill favorably to the House of Representatives. All those in favor of the bill say aye.
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 Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
can I request a recorded vote?
a recorded vote has been requested. Further proceedings on this bill will be postponed. I now call up for consideration H.R. 5608, the Chronic Wasting Disease Research and Management Act, sponsored by our colleague, the distinguished ranking member from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson. And without objection, the first reading of the bill is now waived, and it is open for amendment at any time. And now I recognize the sponsor of the bill, our ranking member, Mr. Thompson, to speak on his bill.
Chairman, thank you so much. I want to thank you for agreeing to consider this important legislation, and each of my colleagues who have signed on to the bill as co-sponsors. Chronic wasting disease, or CWD, is a contagious neurological disease affecting cervids. That would be deer, elk, moose, that is always fatal. CWD has already been detected in at least 25 states, as I mentioned earlier, with no known cure and very little information about the transmission of the disease. Now, I'm concerned CWD continue its rapid spread across the country. The bill before you authorizes up to $70 million in appropriations each year, with the money split evenly to support both CWD research and on-the-ground management efforts at the state and tribal level. This program would support high-priority research to improve CWD detection methods and continue invaluable research on genetic resistance, all in hopes of slowing the spread of CWD and one day, hopefully, eliminating the disease altogether. The priorities outlined in this bill reflect the consensus of both farmed and wild deer stakeholder groups, as well as those of the sportsman's community at large. And I appreciate the partnership of these stakeholders, as well as that of Mr. Kind, in developing this carefully crafted bill, and I wholeheartedly support this legislation and encourage my colleagues to do the same, and I yield back the balance of my time.
And I thank the gentleman. Before we begin on any amendments, does any member wish to speak on the bill? Any member? Hearing no further discussion, without objection, H.R. 5608 is open for amendment at any point. Is there anybody seeking recognition for an amendment? The chair hearing no further amendments, the question now occurs on the reporting the bill favorably to the House of Representatives. All those in favor of the bill say aye.
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 Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. I now call up for consideration H.R. 3532, a resolution to require the Secretary of Agriculture to carry out a periodic wildfire assessment and for other purposes. Sponsored by our colleague, the distinguished gentleman from Arizona, Mr. O'Halloran. I now recognize Mr. O'Halloran, the sponsor of the bill, to speak on his bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Thank you, members of the committee and ranking member. As you know, wildfire has devastated Arizona and much of the West in recent years. We continue to see losses due to unabated wildfire, much of it as a result of untold devastation to our communities. Despite the year-to-year increase in fires, we still do not fully understand the true impact that wildfire has on our communities. I worked in a bipartisan manner to develop this legislation and was happy to work with my colleagues on this committee, Mr. LaMalfa and Mr. Panetta, to put forward a product that would help local, state, and federal governments understand the true cost of wildfires. My fellow colleague from Arizona, Congresswoman Kirkpatrick, and as of this morning, my friend Congressman Costa, have also lent their support to this important piece of legislation. I think everyone in this room understands the cost of fire is much higher than the simple suppression cost, which is large in and of itself. We need to understand the human cost, the watershed cost, and the true cost to many of our rural economies. After the Schultz fire near Flagstaff, Arizona in 2010, the Ecological Restoration Institute of Northern Arizona University conducted 2 longitudinal studies. These studies showed that the fire had significant cost to the community. These studies also showed that investments in risk reduction and mitigation could reduce the cost to the community as well. A more recent example of the importance of this bill is the July 2019 museum fire that threatened the lives and livelihoods of Flagstaff residents. This fire was originally sparked by forest thinning work from a federal contractor. This area, which has not been prone to major flooding prior to the incident, has most recently seen significant and frequent flooding. Now, residents along Grandview Avenue and residents of Sunnyside neighborhoods continue to feel the impact of this fire every time there is a heavy rain in northern Arizona, especially during the monsoon season. The cumulative cost of this fire are still being felt to this day. I'm frustrated by the late notice of the technical assistance we received from the Forest Service yesterday. This request had been put in March of this year. I still absolutely believe in the importance of this legislation and believe that it is important that we get it right as opposed to doing it today. Wildfire is not and should be not be a partisan issue, and I believe it makes sense to take a step back, work with the Forest Service, and help incorporate their feedback as well as that of the ranking member and the minority of this committee. In exchange for their commitment to work together on this bill and eventually offer their support, I would ask that the committee withdraw H.R. 3532 from consideration today, and I would appreciate that commitment. And thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Does any other member wish to speak on the bill?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes, Mr. Costa.
I want to thank Representative O'Halloran for this important legislation of which I'm a co-sponsor. We had last year a subcommittee hearing with that has the jurisdiction over the U.S. Forest Service, and had learned that the forest management plan has not been updated in a long time period. And I think this legislation would help really highlight the impacts, especially in the western states that have been devastated over the last 5 years with extreme drought conditions. Fire has been a constant. As a matter of fact, we say now in California that we no longer have a fire season, we have a fire year. And the impacts and lives lost, in dislocation, and the economic impacts have been in the billions and billions of dollars. And clearly, we need to get a handle on this. This legislation would produce a report 2 years after the date of enactment, and every 5 years thereafter would detail direct and indirect costs of wildfires and who has the burden and the cost. Each report would be compared to the preceding report. The bottom line, in my view, is that for decades now, we've done a poor job in managing our forests. And this is not to point finger or to lay blame. It has run through a number of administrations, Republican and Democratic alike. We tend to put a lot of money in the Forest Service's budget to do fire suppression, a lot less money for forest management. The two are directly related. And I believe that if we did a better job in our forest management and address these impacts as we learn a much better way to manage our forests, not only would we reduce the amount of fires that take place, we'd have an ability to control them to a much greater degree. And the University of California at Merced that I represent is doing some very innovative research. And in California, by the way, 61% of our forests is owned by the federal government. To that, when you reduce the growth and the brush, that we do a better job of maintaining our snowpack that translates into water that is used, especially during these extreme drought conditions. With excessive vegetation, that water is consumed, and therefore it can't be used for the other more important purposes, in my view, which would be for human needs, for the other production of food and fiber, and also it would have an overall environmental benefit. So this legislation, were it to become law, would, I think, require the U.S. Forest Service to get a better handle on the needs between forest management and fire suppression and how we do a better job going forward. This is something that I think is not only in the interest in the western states, but throughout the country. And so I therefore commend the author for his efforts on the legislation and support the bill wholeheartedly and ask for the committee for an aye vote. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Costa. And now I recognize myself for just a brief moment. This work by Mr. O'Halloran is very important. He's been at a very strong leadership position on our western border to deal with these ravaging forest fires. And I commend him for his excellent work on that, and certainly appreciate the ranking member working with him. Mr. Ranking Member, do you wish to be recognized now to make a commitment of working on this bill with Mr. O'Halloran from Arizona?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Chairman. And I want to thank the gentleman from Arizona. I know we share a passion for proper, healthy forest management. And I appreciate his work on this bill. I just, after, and it looks at a very comprehensive way, the analysis, but, and it looks at a lot of important things that I think we need to be tracking to help us to show the impact of these wildfires in a more, in a better light, so that not just those of us who make public policy decisions, but the general public understands the impact of these out-of-control wildfires. And But we know, with the technical assistance from the Forest Service, identified a number of concerns that I think are opportun. I look at them as opportunities that we can address. And although more wildfire data could be helpful in so many cases, this legislation needs more development and consultation with the Forest Service. And I absolutely commit to work with the gentleman, with you, Mr. Chairman, and a gentleman from Arizona on this bill and other fronts moving forward to help our states and so many others. Much greater management is needed based on current data, especially given the testimony we received from the Biden administration Forest Service chief the other week. Our Republican members have introduced a number of thoughtful forestry proposals related to wildfire and active management. And along with consideration of this specific piece of legislation, I'd like to work with you on these additional proposals, seek technical assistance from the Forest Service, and really fully vet and develop each bill with the stakeholders. And so I look forward to working with you, Mr. O'Halloran. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member. I thank you for your comments. And the bill for now, is withdrawn.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to speak on the bill.
I think that's Mr. Lamont.
Who seeks recognition?
Lamalfa, California.
For what purpose does the gentleman wish to speak?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to speak for a moment on Mr. O'Halloran's bill.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'll thank you to also Mr. O'Halloran for HR 3532. I think it's very important that the Forest Service documents indeed what are the costs of wildfire and general of the lands it's supposed to be taking care of. And so I would share frustration, I think, with the author. I don't want to speak for him, but I know this bill was introduced some time ago, and only yesterday do we get 6 points from the Forest Service talking about all the reasons it's going to be so difficult in order to have a cost accountability for wildfire and what the value of forest lands that are burned. And so I that frustrates me because it looks more like excuses. Instead, one of the points is that it would require 100 people working full time to figure out the cost of all wildfire and wildfire suppression. How in the world did they get 100 people into a building to figure out the cost of this? And if that's what it takes, then why don't they scale back to something that's a little closer to a good estimate? And on private concerns, it wouldn't be that difficult. And so, it's just like it's more of a way to say no towards the accountability that they should be having built in all along anyway, if they're going to be charged with taking care of these lands. So they're talking about one of the points would be difficult in order to request the data from private individuals or private entities. So my understanding is maybe we could amend that part and have it not cover private, just, even though forest fires that start on Forest Service lands affect private people, maybe we can move that part out. So I just hear a lot of reasons why it's hard to do and can't be done. And that's really frustrating me because they want to continue to be charged with taking care of these lands. So I'm frustrated by this, and I hope Mr. O'Halloran will continue with the bill in some effort in some form, and I look forward to working with him and my other colleagues that are co-sponsors on that, because we need that accountability, and it's just tired excuse one after another for why things can't be done and shouldn't be done. Maybe they shouldn't be in charge of so much responsibility with all the acres that they have in California and through the West, and have more stewardship processes that they could be partnering with others in order to take care of these lands. So, I appreciate the effort by the author and being able to be a co-sponsor. And, we got to do better and demand better. Otherwise, something needs to be radically different. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the remainder of my time.
Well, thank you very much. And we will be working with Mr. O'Halloran on this bill. These piercing, ravaging fires that are burning up in our western part of our nation must be resolved. And Mr. Halloran, we appreciate your leadership. For now, the bill is withdrawn. I now call up for consideration House Resolution 4489, which is the National Forest Restoration and Remediation Act, sponsored by our colleague, the distinguished gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Schreier. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Conservation and Forestry is discharged from further consideration on H.R. 4489. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is waived, and it is now open for amendment at any point. And I now recognize the sponsor of the bill, excuse me, Ms. Schreier, to speak on her bill.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You grab a glass of water. I am very excited that the committee is marking up my bill, the National Forest Restoration and Remediation Act, to help the Forest Service fund the cleanup of damaged forest lands, and this has been a theme today. This common sense, simple bipartisan bill would allow the Forest Service to collect and keep the interest earned on settlement funds, much like other federal agencies can, in order to supplement restoration efforts. The Forest Service is responsible for overseeing the remediation and restoration of lands damaged by mining activities and human-caused wildfires. And when the negligent actions of companies or individuals result in damages to Forest Service property, officials enter a settlement agreement with the responsible parties to hold them accountable. And the Forest Service then uses the settlement funds to conduct restoration and remediation actions on the affected lands. Now, at the moment, the Forest Service does not have the authority to retain interest on those settlement funds like other federal agencies, such as the Department of the Interior or the EPA. The National Forest Restoration and Remediation Act would allow the Forest Service to retain interest on settlement funds and apply those additional resources to complete necessary restoration work. Without this additional funding, the value of settlement funds diminishes over time, and the Forest Service can face long-term budget shortfalls for environmental cleanup. If this bill had been in place between fiscal years 2015 and 2019, the Forest Service would have received more than $7.5 million to supplement environmental restoration. So as we confront another potentially devastating wildfire season, it is important that we ensure the Forest Service can retain more funds to protect and remediate forests. Forest Service provides many important environmental services in Washington state, including mitigating wildfires and improving forest health. This is especially critical in places like Chelan County in my district, where over 82% of the land is owned by the Forest Service. And according to the National Interagency Fire Center, there were over 50,000 human-caused wildfires just last year, burning nearly 6 million acres nationwide. And on Forest Service land specifically, over half of wildfires are started by humans. So my bill will allow that we hold bad actors accountable for negligent behavior in a manner that sufficiently provides the Forest Service with the resources it needs to protect our treasured public lands. I was proud to introduce this bill with my colleague on this committee, Representative LaMalfa, as well as Representatives Rosendale and Neguse. I want to thank you, Chairman Scott, and the staff of the Agriculture Committee for bringing forward this important bill today, and I yield back. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady. And now I recognize myself for a few minutes here because, as I mentioned a little earlier, our forestry is so important, and it's rich in some very devastating damage right now. And this bill is an excellent example of the bipartisan work that we are accomplishing here at the Agriculture Committee. And I applaud Representative Schreier and Representative LaMalfa for working together to get this legislation to this point. And we know that there are significant needs for investment and restoration and recovery work on our national forests. And this legislation provides a very simple solution. The bill allows the Forest Service to keep interest earned on settlement funds and then apply these additional resources to restoration work on Forest Service land that has been damaged by mining activity and the wildfires. So I'm very happy to support Representative Schreier's bill and LaMoffa's bill to ensure that our Forest Service can use interest-bearing accounts to improve forest health. Thank you both very much. Before we begin with any amendments, does any member wish to speak on Ms. Schreier and Mr. LaMoffa's bill?
May I speak, Mr. Chairman?
Yes. Who seeks recognition?
LaMalfa, California.
Oh, Mr. LaMoffa seeks recognition. For what purpose does the gentleman request?
Introduce after.
Okay, thank you. I'm multitasking
You moved
here.
to strike the last
I
word.
appreciate that. I appreciate the work Ms. Schreier has provided on 4489. I just want to say it's a pleasure to be able to be a co-sponsor on that, and it's certainly a very sensible way of looking at things with having the dollars that's generated by the activity go back into the work that needs to be done in our forests. You know, in this case, speaking about restoration, you know, obviously with so much wildfire in the West, our restoration needs are extreme and acute. And so, you know, when we had a recent opportunity here for putting funding forward for registration for the millions of acres in recent years, we need to take every opportunity. So I'm glad to be part of the legislation. I appreciate Ms. Schreier and her work on this. So I'll yield back the balance of time, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. Is there anyone else who seeks recognition? Hearing no further discussions, without objection, H.R. 4489 is now open for amendment at any point. Who seeks recognition? Hearing no further amendments, the question now occurs on reporting the bill favorably to the House. All those in favor of the bill say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. I now call up for consideration H.R. 5609, the Cattle Contract Library Act of 2021, sponsored by our colleague, the distinguished gentleman from South Dakota, Mr. Johnson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the recognition and thank you for this markup. Any business person understands the importance of price discovery. It's a critically important part of any functioning market, and you can't have price discovery if you don't have transparency. Now, this transparency used to be real easy in the cattle market. Overwhelmingly, people took their cattle down to the sale barn, and boy, you want to talk about transparency, everybody there can see exactly what the bids are. Now, as we've had sales move away from the sale barn, away from cash sale, and toward alternate marketing agreements, transparency has been harder to come by. And so what this bill does is it injects much-needed transparency back into this marketplace. So I think we should have high confidence that this is the right thing to do for two reasons. First off, the committee process works. We have vetted these ideas through two recent hearings before this committee. We have had a number of experts, including producers, who every single day go out in the field and work with the cattle and try to figure out how to market their cattle. And overwhelmingly, we have heard that this is an important step. We have heard those producers, and we have integrated their feedback into this concept. Number two, and I've talked about this a lot, but consensus has sometimes been hard to find in the livestock marketplace, but we have it here. A few months ago, the Livestock Marketing Group Association did a really good job in pulling together the key market players in Phoenix and telling them that they needed to reach consensus so that we could move forward to get good things done here in the policy arena. That group came away, that meeting came away with 3 priorities: additional transparency, more robust investigation, and additional capacity. And we're making progress in those areas, including number 1, transparency. That group came out and endorsed those 3 arenas, including a cattle contract library that sits before this committee right now. And for people who say that this isn't a silver bullet, they are absolutely right. We are building, we've had a pretty good run, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. We have had Congresswoman Craig and I have leveled the playing field for small processors earlier this year. The administration took the key concepts that Abigail Spanberger and I had advanced in the Butcher Block Act. We are getting real things done, but the work is not done. The work needs to continue, but make no doubt about it, this is a consensus-based and a critically important step as we move forward. With that, I would reserve my time and stand by for any questions.
I thank the gentleman, and I do want to make a brief statement. I support this fine work by Mr. Johnson. As you all may remember, at our recent livestock hearing, it was very clear that few cattle market policies enjoy complete consensus. And one of the consensus is that we do not want livestock mandatory reporting to expire. And I have a bill, as many of you know, H.R. 5290, that takes care of extending this program for 1 year. Mr. Johnson's bill is very important, and I support it wholeheartedly. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is waived. And now, before we begin on amendments, if there are any, is there any other member that wishes to speak on Mr. Johnson's bill? Ms. Craig of Minnesota, for what purpose does the general lady seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to say thank you to my colleague, Mr. Johnson, and also Mr. Quaylar for leading this really important bill. You know, price transparency and discovery lead to greater competition. And of course, that helps farmers and ranchers across my district and across the country. This is just one piece of a larger puzzle that we must continue to address. And I look forward to these bipartisan conversations that will continue on the issue. I urge my colleagues to support this bill. I also just wanted to make a quick comment and thank my colleagues for supporting in advance the Chronic Wasting Disease Research and Management Act. I've long advocated for continued focus on this issue given the devastating impact of chronic wasting disease, and I appreciate the fact that stakeholders have come together to support this bill. Just wanted to give a shout out as well to Mr. Kind, who represents a district right across the Mississippi River from me, as well as to the ranking member for your leadership on it. So thank you so much for getting us together, Mr. Chairman, for such a bipartisan effort here this morning. And with that, I yield back.
Lady yields back. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Mann of Kansas. Oh. For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word. Would like to speak on behalf of the bill and have a quick question for Mr. Johnson.
Yes, the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, Chairman Scott and Ranking Member Thompson, I echo the sentiments of my colleagues on the process leading up to today's committee markup. While I appreciate the dialogue, I too would have appreciated more time to hear from stakeholders and constituents on many of these bills before bringing them to the committee for a vote. In regards to H.R. 5609 to amend the Agriculture Marketing Act of 1946 to establish a cattle contract library, I'd like to thank Representative Johnson and his staff for their tireless work. I know that they went out of their way to work with cattle producers from Kansas and other states to craft this bill. The concept of a cattle contract library, as already mentioned, is not new. In fact, we have heard from stakeholders and constituents on this issue for years. Just a few weeks ago, this committee heard from witnesses on the issue. The cattle contract library is a simple step towards more fairness, more transparency, and healthy competition in the cattle market. It will benefit producers and packers alike, as it will help ensure that all market participants are both paying and receiving a fair price for their goods. The cattle contract library sends a clear message to ranchers, farmers, and livestock producers across the country that their voices are being heard by this committee here in Washington. As the needs of producers change, however, I think it is equally important that we have the opportunity to adjust legislation like the cattle contract library. As I understand it, the cattle contract library would need to be reauthorized as part of the livestock mandatory reporting, LMR. Kansans also deserve to know whether upon reauthorization we're able to re-examine the legislation. Representative Johnson, can you confirm, or would you be willing to confirm that the cattle contract library would need to be reauthorized as part of livestock mandatory reporting moving forward?
So, Congressman, yeah, you can see that in the Section 2 of the bill that this contract library is placed within the Agricultural Marketing Act of 1946, and that's something that mandatory price reporting reauthorization would address. So you would have an opportunity to go in and change these provisions if the committee so desired.
Great, and I think that's important. You know, this market is constantly changing. Let's take a look at this in a few years, make sure that it's had the intended consequences, and really appreciate that. And thank you. And again, thank you, Mr. Johnson, for your work and leadership that you put into this very important legislation. I urge my colleagues to support it. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Yes, thank you. The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. DaCosta of California.
Thank
For
you.
what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word, Mr.
Gentleman is recognized. 5 minutes.
Seem to have a robust legislative agenda this morning, but I want to speak to support H.R. 5609. Ranking Member Johnson on the Subcommittee on Livestock that I have the honor to chair has been passionate, as you can tell from his comments, and very energetic in his efforts to work with the cattle and livestock industry in this nation. And I want to commend also Representative Craig for her efforts in trying to put together a bipartisan effort, which I think this legislation reflects. It goes, I think, hand in hand, Mr. Chairman, with your legislation, which is the clean reauthorization for 1 year. The livestock industry in the United States is dynamic. It's changing. And it has a lot of, I think, challenges that we face, that we've learned certainly in the 20 months of a pandemic. A healthcare crisis that has literally, last year, as we've all noted, with the closure of schools and restaurants, turned a complex, complicated food supply chain upside down. And as a result of that, we have had dislocations in the market. We have had other impacts that we could never have foresaw or anticipated prior to the pandemic. And I think with good faith, and there have, I think, been some robust discussions that have taken place among competing interests. We need to allow folks to come together in ways that make sense. And I think that Representative Johnson has attempted to do that with this Contract Library Act and bringing parties together. I commend him for his efforts. The fact is that I hope we've learned some lessons as a result of this pandemic and our food supply chain. because, again, it relates to my earlier comments, food is a national security issue. And the fact is that I think we need to continue to look on ways in which we can ensure that people in the cattle business, and I have had family members that have been associated with it for decades, reflect the needs that a consuming public has in this country to ensure that we get the finest product available at effective costs, consumer costs, point costs, and that we ensure that that supply chain remains robust and competitive and transparent, as the representative indicated in his opening comments. Transparency, I think, is a critical factor in all of this. So we'll continue to work on this. We have other issues that are out there, and it's my intent, Mr. Chairman, to work with the ranking member of the subcommittee, not only in these two pieces of legislation, but as we move forward to work with all of the elements of the livestock industry in this country, making sure that everybody has a seat at the table and their voices are heard so that we can work in a constructive fashion. So with that said, I commend the author for his efforts, and I can commend the chairman for his one-year reauthorization, clean reauthorization of the legislation that I will support. So with that said, I yield back the balance of my time, and I thank you very much.
The gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman, this is Representative Rick Allen from Georgia.
For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
I would like to make a few comments about the legislation we're conducting here.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, of course, we had a hearing on this recently, but there needs to be a lot more transparency in the price discovery process in the livestock industry. There is a lot of disagreement on what producers are receiving for the on their behalf versus what the packers are receiving on their side. And so, we did this in the swine industry a few years ago. It seems to have improved to that. But I, certainly think and look forward to monitoring the cattle markets after this bill is signed into law to see if this bill provides adequate protection for our farmers to ensure they're not being scammed in the marketplace. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman.
Mr. Chairman.
For who seeks recognition?
This is Spanberger from Virginia.
For what purpose does the gentlelady seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today in support of the Cattle Contract Library Act. I was thrilled that my friend and colleague, Representative Dusty Johnson, introduced this legislation following up on the hearing this committee held earlier this month. Cattle producers have faced many challenges related to weather conditions, supply chain issues, and volatile market conditions over the past few years, and I have heard these concerns directly from Central Virginia's livestock producers. From the testimonies heard before this committee, it's clear that our livestock and cattle industry would be best served by greater transparency in the market. Competition, price discovery, and transparency are desperately needed and are good for the functioning of any marketplace. The concept behind this bill is not new. USDA and Congress have already recognized the value of contract libraries in the context of the pork industry, and this committee has already heard testimony from several voices in the cattle industry asking the same concept be applied to the sale of cattle. This legislation is common sense, and I am proud to be an original co-sponsor of the Cattle Contract Library Act. I'm also thankful to my colleague, Rep. Johnson, for introducing this legislation, and I urge my colleagues on the committee to vote yes on passage of this bill in the markup and on the floor of the House. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. Is there anyone else who seeks recognition? Hearing no further discussion without objections, H.R. 5609 is open for amendment at any point. Is any member wish to make an amendment? Hearing no further amendments, the question now occurs on reporting the bill favorably to the House. All those in favor of the bill say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. I now call up for consideration H.R. 5589, the Pyrolysis Innovation Grants Act, sponsored by our colleague, the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Harder. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is waived, and it is open for amendments at any point. I now recognize myself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5589, which is at the desk. Without objection, the reading of the amendment is waived, and the substitute will be considered as original text for the purpose of further amendments. I now recognize the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Harder, to speak on his bill.
Thank you so much, Chairman Scott. Today, I'm proud to speak on my bill scheduled for markup, H.R. 5589, the Pyrolysis Innovation Grants Act. This bill will establish a first-of-its-kind pyrolysis grant program at USDA, directed by the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. Specifically, it funds at least 10 pilot projects that will fight greenhouse gas emissions by turning tree nut byproducts, like almond shells, into higher value biocarbon products like fuels and biochar. This in turn will help create new, green, high-paying jobs while keeping our air clean and our soil fertile. And best of all, those jobs will be created right here in America, rather than in China or Mexico or anywhere else. Every year, we grow more than 1 billion pounds of nuts in America. Half of that weight is the delicious nuts that you find in your bag of snacks. But the other hundreds of millions of pounds are the shells that our farmers are forced to get rid of by burning in open fields. Burning those shells injects smoke in our air, costs our farmers money, and does no good for anybody. So this bill funds projects that use a process called pyrolysis that turns those nutshells into everything from fuel for our cars to nutrients for our soil. We don't have to get into the science, but I will tell you about the incredible impact that this is going to have on agricultural communities like mine. If you're the almond or pistachio farmer living down the street from me in Turlock, pyrolysis means you can sell your shells for profit, opening up a brand new stream of revenue for your business. It turns something that costs you money into something that makes you money. If you're a worker looking for a better paying job, pyrolysis means you can get one of thousands of new jobs this technology will create. I've toured the plants that are doing this work in the Central Valley right now, and I know our workers will see an incredible return on the investment in this bill. If you're a kid growing up with childhood asthma, just like I did, pyrolysis means farmers are no longer burning shells and creating smoke close to where you live or where you go to school. It means one day you might be able to put that inhaler down for good. And if you're a parent worried about the kind of planet you're leaving to your kids, pyrolysis means we have another tool in our toolbox to fight climate change in ag communities like ours. It's a win for farmers, a win for workers, a win for kids, and a win for anybody who cares about our planet. And here's the best part. You can't ship 500 million pounds of nutshells to China. So our communities right here in America will reap the rewards for investments in this tech 10 and 100 times over. Investments in pyrolysis have support for environmentalists and ag groups alike. Now it's the time that we come together and get it done. I'd like to take this time to thank Representatives Costa and Panetta, who have been supporters of this bill and pyrolysis from the get-go and our original co-sponsors. I'd also like to thank Chairman Scott for helping bring this bill before the committee today for markup. I'm so excited to see this bill progress. I ask that all members of the committee support this bill today, and I thank you all for your support.
I thank you, gentlemen. And before we begin with any possible amendments, does any other member wish to speak on the bill?
Mr. Chairman.
Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman, as ranking member, I seek to speak on the bill.
All right. You're recognized for 5 minutes, Mr. Thompson.
All right, Chairman. Hey, I want to thank the gentleman from California for his interest in this issue. If the intent of this bill is to conduct research on the use of pyrolysis on agricultural products, USDA currently can conduct both the intramural and extramural research on this topic, making a new competitive grant program unnecessary. In fact, the Agricultural Research Service currently has 3 research projects in California specifically focused on the use of this process on tree nut byproducts. NIFA also has competitive grant programs like the Agriculture and Food Research Initiative and the Specialty Crop Research Initiative that currently fund research on the use of pyrolysis on tree nut byproducts. And if the intent of this bill is to fund the equipment needed to use pyrolysis on agricultural byproducts, there are programs that would be better equipped to handle this issue, like EQIP. With that said, I look forward to working into the future with Representative Harder's office to figure out the need here and to ensure that the actual need that's out there is solved through this bill. And with that, I yield back.
Who else seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Baird from Indiana.
Mr. Barrett, for what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Well, I think the ranking member made an interesting observation about having some of these projects already underway in other areas. But anyway, this technology really decomposes the organic material like biomass, and we have a lot of that in agriculture. And so I think there's an opportunity here if we conduct the appropriate research in order to develop another source of energy and to also provide the opportunity to dispose of byproducts at the present time. So I've long had an interest in the bioproducts, and this bill really presents a unique opportunity to come together and figure out how to best proceed. I'm excited that NIFA and our ARS have undertaken projects in this space, and it shows there's a willingness to either enhance those projects or to add to them. So I do have some reservation, about setting up a new grant program at the department when it's already underway. So, Mr. Harder, I welcome your commitment to work together to make this bill work as intended, and I hope that we can do so that we do not duplicate the current efforts at the department. And with that, I yield back.
Okay. Chairman yields back. Who else seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman, this is Congressman Rick Allen.
For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, we're already doing this in Georgia. In fact, it's extensive with our peanut shells, and we're compressing that and shipping it to Europe for clean burning fuel for their power generating plants. So I look forward to working with the gentleman from California so that, again, this technology is already available. It's out there. We're doing it right now. We're shipping it out of the Port of Savannah. And but I'll be glad to work with the gentleman from California on how we're doing that in those markets that are available to farmers across the nation. As far as any need for additional grant money, like I said, I think, again, this technology is already there. Perhaps there are some other uses that we need to investigate, but I agree. I don't think we need any kind of specialty grants for further programs on this. This technology is the horse is already out of the barn on this. So, but I look forward to working extensively with, like I said, across the nation on what we're doing in Georgia. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Anyone else seeks recognition? Hearing no further requests, without question, the committee will consider now the whole amendment and the nature of a substitute. And does anyone seek recognition? All right. Hearing no further amendments, the question now occurs on reporting the bill favorably to the House. All those in favor of the bill say aye.
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 Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Okay. We will now proceed with recorded votes that were postponed from earlier on H.R. 4252, which was and is the 1890s scholarship program being made permanent with the $100 million in funding. And the question now occurs on the reporting of the bill out favorably to the House. Madam Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Chairman votes aye. Mr. Costa.
Costa votes aye.
Mr. Costa votes aye. Mr. McGovern.
Aye.
Mr. McGovern votes aye. Mr. Vella.
Aye.
Mr. Vella votes aye. Ms. Adams.
Adams votes aye.
Ms. Adams votes aye. Ms. Spanberger.
Aye.
Ms. Spanberger votes aye. Mrs. Hayes.
Hayes votes aye.
Mrs. Hayes votes aye. Mr. Delgado.
Aye.
Mr. Delgado votes aye. Mr. Rush.
Rush votes aye.
Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Pingree.
Pingree votes aye.
Ms. Pingree votes aye. Mr. Sablon. Mr. Sablon. Ms. Custer.
Custer votes aye.
Ms. Custer votes aye. Ms. Bustos.
Bustos votes aye.
Ms. Bustos votes aye. Mr. Maloney. Mr. Maloney.
Aye.
Mr. Maloney votes aye. Ms. Plaskett.
Plaskett votes aye.
Ms. Plaskett votes aye. Mr. O'Halloran.
O'Halloran votes aye.
Mr. O'Halloran votes aye. Mr. Carbajal.
Carbajal votes aye.
Mr. Carbajal votes aye. Mr. Khanna.
Aye.
Mr. Khanna votes aye. Mr. Lawson.
Mr. Lawson votes aye.
Mr. Lawson votes aye. Mr. Correa.
Correa votes aye.
Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Craig.
Craig of Minnesota votes aye.
Ms. Craig votes aye. Mr. Harder.
Aye.
Mr. Harder votes aye. Mrs. Axney.
Axney votes aye.
Mrs. Axney votes aye. Ms. Schreier.
Schreier votes aye.
Ms. Schreier votes aye. Mr. Panetta.
Panetta, aye.
Mr. Panetta votes aye. Mrs. Kirkpatrick. Mrs. Kirkpatrick. Mr. Bishop.
Mr. Bishop votes aye.
Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Thompson. Aye. Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Austin Scott.
Aye.
Mr. Austin Scott votes aye. Mr. Crawford.
Aye.
Mr. Crawford votes aye. Mr. Desjardins.
Aye.
Mr. Desjardins votes aye. Mrs. Hartzler. Mrs. Hartzler. Mr. LaMalfa.
LaMalfa, aye.
Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis votes aye. Mr. Allen?
Allen votes aye.
Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Rouser? Mr. Rouser votes aye. Mr. Kelly?
Aye.
Mr. Kelly votes aye. Mr. Bacon? Mr. Bacon? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Baird? Mr. Baird votes aye. Mr. Hagedorn? Mr. Hagedorn votes aye. Mr. Jacobs?
Jacobs, aye.
Mr. Jacobs votes aye. Mr. Balderson?
Alderson votes aye.
Mr. Balderson votes aye. Mr. Cloud? No. Mr. Cloud votes no. Mr. Mann?
Mann votes aye.
Mr. Mann votes aye. Mr. Feenstra? Mr. Feenstra votes aye. Mrs. Miller?
Miller votes no.
Mrs.
What?
Miller votes no. Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes aye. Mrs. Kamick? Mrs. Kamick votes aye. Mrs. Fishbach?
No.
Mrs. Fishbach votes no. Ms. Letlow?
Letlow votes aye.
Ms. Letlow votes aye. Mr. Sablon?
Sablon votes aye.
Mr. Sablon votes aye. Mrs. Kirkpatrick? Mrs. Kirkpatrick? Mrs. Hartzler? Mrs. Hartzler? Mr. Bacon?
Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the yeas are 45, the nays are 3.
A majority having voted in favor, the motion is agreed to, and the motion and the accompanying materials shall be favorably reported to the House. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Any member wishing to file supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views to H.R. 4252, to H.R. 5608, H.R. 4489, H.R. 5609, or H.R. 5589 must have them submitted to the clerk's office at 1303 Longworth by 5 p.m. on Thursday, October 28th. And without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes as appropriate to the matters considered by the committee in this markup without changing the substance of the legislation. Before we adjourn, as chairman, I'd just like to say thank you to this committee for the very strong bipartisan support Democrats and Republicans who have given here today to the 1890s student scholarship program at the African American colleges and universities. We thank you from the bottom of our hearts. I know each of our 19 presidents who came and testified are most grateful as well. And untold millions of students who would not have an education will now get one, thanks to what we have done today with this strong bipartisan support. So I want to just personally thank everyone from the bottom of my heart, and God bless you.
Mr. Chairman,
Chair, who seeks recognition?
Adams, North Carolina.
Oh, the gentleman lady, vice chair of our committee. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was on a flight and I wasn't able to get off the comment, but I just want to add my word of thanks and appreciation to the committee for the support for our 1890s. Certainly, I know that our presidents and our chancellors are grateful, and certainly our students are going to benefit. And I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing it forward. I just had to add my 2 cents, and thank you for allowing me to do that.
Well, it's my pleasure. And as our chairman of our HBCU's caucus, I know you're deeply proud as well and speak for all of us. So thank everybody. And any member, this concludes today's business meeting. Again, I thank all members, and this meeting is now adjourned. Thank you.